This episode is produced with support from the National Centre for Biological Sciences.
Welcome back to Biolore, where we are narrating some very interesting stories from the history of biological sciences in India. The last one was on zebrafish, biology's favorite model organism. If you didn't hear why this fish has a place in history, you can go back and get hold of that episode on the Nature India podcast.
On the sands of time, stories unfold, treasures from the past to modern lore. Every leaf, every cell, life secrets they tell. Biolore.
Today's episode comes wrapped in a subtle sensory delight, something like what comes when you have just had a hearty meal of biryani, the unmistakable aroma of basmati rice. I'm your host, Shubhra Priyadarshini. We begin today's story at the turn of the 21st century in India. Farmers in the fertile Indo-Gangetic plains are excitedly chatting about a slender grained rice. This is a basmati variety, which they reverently call Karza Fard or debt reliever. This is Pusa Basmati 1 or PB1. Remember that name? It's going to come up in our story many times today. Indian scientists bred this grain, and the first crops have just hit the market. They kickstart a basmati revolution, doubling exports and making India a rice production major along with China. The world is hooked to Indian basmati, a flavor that once only could be sampled in royal kitchens. It's got a nutty flavor, and that flavor is basically a snapshot of the climate of the Indo-Gangetic plains. Pusa Basmati 1 quickly becomes a canvas for gastronomy innovations. People are making pulaus, biryanis, kheer, and even reinventing dishes you would least expect. There are Italian risottos and arancinis, Japanese maki rolls, even ice creams being made out of basmati. The first recorded description of basmati was in the 18th century when famous Punjabi poet Waris Shah talked of it in the love story Heer Ranjha.
ਮੁਸ਼ਕੀ ਚਾਵਲਾਂ ਦੇ ਭਰੇ ਦੇ ਅਨਕੋਠੇ ਸੋਇਆਂ ਪਤੀ ਤੇ ਝੋਨਰੇ ਚੜੀ ਦੇ ਨੀ ਬਾਸਮਤੀ ਮੁਸਾਫਰੀ ਬੇਗਮੀ ਸੂ ਹਰਚੰਦ ਦੀ ਜ਼ਰੀ ਦੇ ਧਰੀ ਦੇ ਨੀ.
Today, the basmati infatuation is everywhere from reality TV to fiction writing. Influencers keep giving us top tips on how to make the best basmati dishes, and the grains have a special love affair with diaspora Asians everywhere. But behind the scenes, scientists and breeders battle climate change, the scourge of pests and diseases, to bring to us what the Taste Atlas calls the best rice in the world. We will also hear today about the drama associated with this delicious grain, a patent war that sparked a debate over intellectual property rights, the rise of fake basmati varieties. We'll hear also about the enormous amounts of water that this crop guzzles, and India and Pakistan staking claim over the geographical indication or GI tag of basmati. Clearly, it's complicated. So let's begin by understanding what makes basmati unique.
That comes from, amylose is one of the starch component. And amylose, if it is lower than, say, 20%, then the rice tends to become sticky. If it is more than 25%, the cooked rice tends to become a little harder. And ideally, basmati should have an intermediate amylose, around 22%, in the range of 20-25%. So it has good mouthfeel and a taste and appeal and high volume expansion. You cook 1 cup of rice and it can expand maybe 4 times or 4.5 times more. You can cook a small quantity of rice and make many plates.
Ashok Kumar Singh there, joining us from the Indian Agricultural Research Institute in Pusa, New Delhi. He assures us that this ideal amylose percentage legally defines basmati.
And there is often a confusion that all aromatic rices are basmati, which is not true. All basmati rices are aromatic, but all aromatic rices are not basmati.
Well, Singh knows this only too well. He is a basmati rice breeder at the institute. His council's labs and trial farms have been churning out variety after variety of high yielding basmati. These account for the majority of India's rice exports. Authentic Indian basmati grows in 7 states in the Indo Gangetic plains on the foothills of the Himalayas. These offer the precise environmental conditions that activate the genetic cocktail that creates the signature smell, taste, and texture of basmati. In fact, traditional basmati varieties staunchly refuse to flower before a fixed date on the calendar, the 10th of October. That's when the aroma kicks in.
The aroma is in its gene, specific chromosome number 8. This is called fragrance gene. They synthesize a compound that is called 2-acetyl-1-pyrrolene. And this is the principal component of basmati aroma. But the expression of aroma, it happens in a given geographical condition. For aroma, so it is the environmental condition, the genetics, and the soil and water factors all collectively give rise to the maximum aroma expression. And that is one reason why basmati is protected under geographical indication, because the expression of these characters would not come if we grow it outside the GI area.
This geographical uniqueness has prompted India to take steps to secure a GI tag for basmati. Only rice grown in these specific regions can be marketed as basmati. This year, India's basmati rice has had an impressive production. We are talking nearly 50,000 crores rupees worth of these grains. Last year, it even made its way to the Capitol Hill when Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi gifted President Joe Biden basmati. You could even call it the grain of diplomacy. All that is very good, but back in the 1960s, scientists were quite worried for this crop. So, perfectly normal crops standing at about 1.5 meters would just keel over and flatten under the weight of their own grains. This thing is called lodging, and it actually destroyed both quality and production.
This has been a drawback with the traditional basmati varieties like the Radhuni basmati. And of course, they have excellent grain and cooking quality. There is no question about it. But if you wanted to produce more of basmati rice, it was important that we should try to improve the productivity, of course, without hampering the grain and cooking quality. And that is where at the Indian Agriculture Research Institute, it was in 1960s, late 60s, around 68 or so, when Dr. Swaminathan, who was heading the institute, conceptualized the idea of combining the quality of traditional basmati into high-yielding background. And the crossing program started with the traditional basmati varieties and high-yielding dwarf non-basmati varieties.
Now, financial well being of farmers with small plots of land. This came into sharp focus with the Basmati program in India. I spoke with Harshvardhan Raghunandan, a PhD candidate in the history department of Yale University in the United States. Harsha recently combed through agricultural scientist M.S. Swaminathan's notes at the archives at National Center for Biological Sciences in Bengaluru.
The whole world eats basmati now, and I think Swaminathan had a significant role to play in this regard.
The MS Swaminathan papers, we're very grateful to have received them, and as they're publicly accessible through the catalog. And so this is an example of the private collections of an individual who's, of course, very well known in the country. But we also, and within that collection, you will see examples of histories of basmati, histories of wheat, different strains of wheat, but also you'll find other narratives emerging from each collection.
That was Venkat Srinivasan at the NCBS archives. Harsha tells me more about these golden years of Indian agriculture.
The basmati strains that Swaminathan is most closely associated with, particularly Pusa basmati 1, which is a high yielding variety of basmati rice that gets synthesized at the Indian Agricultural Research Institute, that strain comes about in the late 1980s. And the reason why it gets synthesized then is because around 20 or 25 years into the Green Revolution, Swaminathan and his colleagues realized that even though food production is at an all-time high, there are questions of equity and distribution with respect to farming incomes, where smallholders aren't earning as much as larger farmers. And so the role that basmati plays, because it earns a lot more value in export markets, is that it allows smallholding farmers in northwestern India, particularly, to earn higher incomes. Basmati is one of those varieties of aromatic rice that can be grown in the plains in regions such as Punjab and Haryana, as well as in hilly regions like Himachal and Uttarakhand. And so its geographic spread is diverse, and its applicability to smallholding farmers in particular is of interest to Swaminathan. In the 1970s, Swaminathan used to say that paddy was almost always associated with poverty. He wanted to twist that relationship around and transform paddy and associate it with prosperity instead. And that's where basmati really comes into play.
Pusa Basmati 1 was the world's first semi-dwarf high-yielding basmati. It was launched in 1989 amid dipping rice stocks. PB1 is shorter than your traditional basmati crop, but it is still formidable at 1 meter high. But why did it take 20 years to bring together all the iconic basmati qualities in one single high-yielding variety?
There are several traits that defines basmati, like length of grain, length on elongation, elongation ratio, temperature, amylose content, fluffiness. They are governed by multiple genes. So when you are dealing with so many genes in a cross which are segregating, it is very difficult to identify a plant which has all the favorable genes together. Now that was the challenge, and we used to cook large number of samples, maybe 2,000, 3,000, to look for those plants which have aroma, which have elongation, and typical basmati quality characters.
Now, how does grain length expand on cooking? This question took years to solve. It was that one crucial piece of the basmati puzzle. E.A. Siddiq, whose group was involved in the Pusa Basmati 1 development, recalls that struggle in this interview with the International Rice Research Institute in Manila, Philippines.
At one stage, some people came to me. They asked, "You are working for so many years, still you have not come out with that high-yielding basmati rice. Should we bring actually Norman Borlaug to develop the kind of basmati you are trying to develop?" I told him, in the presence of many people, you may bring not one Borlaug, you can bring many Borlaugs. If a person understands the complex nature of this basmati quality, and you have to combine with the high yield background of the new plant type varieties, it will not be possible. But in the next 3-4 years, we came out with this variety.
After all these innovations, farmers and consumers got more bang for their buck. The industry embraced innovations to package these longer grains. Breeding continued, and new hardy varieties like PB1121 and PB1509 gradually entered the market. These could cope with the constant onslaught of pests and diseases such as bacterial blight and blast.
Last year I went to some farmers meeting. A group of farmers, about 200 farmers, had gathered in Palla village near Delhi, Daryapur village actually. And one farmer who was almost 90 years old, he came with a flower garland in his hand, and he removed his shoes before he garlanding me. Now, those are kinds of feelings which are very, very touching, and that makes you feel very humble.
Exports of basmati were skyrocketing. Here are some figures to consider. In 1991, India exported about zero point 0.2 million tons of basmati, worth close to 3 billion rupees. In 2011, this had grown to about 10.5 billion rupees from over 2 million tons of exports. That's how much the demand for basmati grew since PB1.
I remember a famous, quote from the farmers, and also many farmers on their tractor trolley, when they will carry the grains to mandi, and they used to write it as karja for basmati, which means, karja is debt, and a variety which had potential to take farmers out of their debt. So that was the kind of, impact this variety had.
Basmati becomes a prized variety of aromatic rice to be consumed in Western markets from about the mid 70s, early 80s onward. And that's related in no small part to Indian migration to the United States. You see a number of Indian migrants going there, popularizing basmati, both in the shops that they set up and in their own consumption choices. Because until the late 70s, long grain aromatic basmati rice as an export commodity was almost completely consumed in the Middle East. But after the 1980s, when you see these migrations to the West by large communities of Indians and South Asians at large, you see basmati being consumed there too. And now you get basmati pretty much everywhere. The trajectory of this variety of aromatic rice is nicely paralleled by jasmine rice from Thailand, which does the same thing.
And my parents, they have been married for 45 years and they hate each other, but they can't be bothered to leave each other. Now, the thing is, there would be serious ramifications, or in their case, ramadamifications, if they split up. Because I think who'd put the bins out? And who'd get the 20-kilogram bag of basmati rice that every Asian person has in their hallway? Most normal people have a hat stand or a table to put their letters. My parents have bags of basmati rice in case there is a famine in Birmingham. If there are ever floods in Birmingham, that house is going to fluff up and burst.
British stand-up comedian Shazia Mirza on the Diaspora Connect with Basmati.
If coffee and tea are some of the charismatic classic cash crops of empire, then basmati is very much a charismatic crop of globalization, right? Because it follows the circuits of late 20th century migration by South Asian groups to the West in particular. And it goes far beyond its initial Middle Eastern export market. So wherever, if you like, South Asian communities have come into economic prosperity in the West, there you've seen basmati grow and grow and grow, whether it's curry houses in the UK or Silicon Valley as a consumed commodity.
Okay, so exports shooting up, much love for the grain around the world, and everything is nice. But in 1997, a storm started brewing. The US Patent and Trademarks Office granted a patent to the Texas-based company RiceTech. The patent was on, quote, basmati rice lines and grains, unquote.
So any rice variety which had some kind of aroma would fall within the ambit of these claims, and that was quite troublesome. Now, to top it all, this patent was called basmati rice varieties. So obviously basmati rice varieties can't be the name which is given to this patent, because basmati is a rice which is grown in India.
That's Rajeshwari Hariharan, a botanist turned patent lawyer. She and her team fought a long battle to counter these claims and revoke the patent. They met scientists, including at Pusa, and trawled through records to gather proof. They wanted to show a rice variety that existed in India before 1995 and was similar to what was being claimed. Scientists were not quite aware of these patent filing processes or laws, so much so that one scientist actually got a bag of rice for them instead of published records.
So there was a scientist, he brought a bag of rice and he said, look, this is the rice variety we have developed. I can analyze it in the lab and I will show you that it has all these properties. He said, this is not what we want. We don't want a bag of rice. We are not going to send a bag of rice to the US. We need a document.
They eventually dug out the magic bullet, buried deep inside an annual report at Pusa.
So we went to almost every possible research institute to look for these kind of varieties which will be documented. And ultimately in Pusa itself, we found the rice variety that we were looking for, there was an annual report which published not only the rice variety, but all its properties. The fact it was semi-dwarf, it was not very tall, the fact that it had pesticide and pest resistant properties, the fact that it would have the grains would have a certain aroma measured by the amount of 2-acetyl 1-pyrrolidine. So that itself was documented. So that was the magic bullet that actually we were looking for.
Now imagine this, they just had one shot to get it right. But the evidence against Rice Tech was overwhelming, so eventually, in 2003, the patent was withdrawn, ending this controversy.
They withdrew all the claims which were relating to the grains. Only the specific varieties they kept. You held a hearing with Rice Tech, and then they said that you have withdrawn those claims, that's fine, but we will not allow you to keep this title, Basmati rice varieties. You will have to change that because you are not Basmati. Ultimately, Rice Tech had to change the title also, and they were left with just 3 claims. And we had no problem with the 3 claims.
There was public backlash, and it added fuel to the fire.
But what our lawyers tell us from the US is that when they submitted this petition, it was just an innocuous revocation petition. But subsequently, the USPTO started getting so many letters from farmers from India, from scientists from India, Canada, Europe, and they were inundated with petitions. Why are you even granting this kind of stuff? How can you grant such a patent to Rice Tech? And that was one of the things that forced Rice Tech, to withdraw their claims.
This litigation basically made scientists aware of intellectual property rights.
Today, if you go to the scientists, they will be able to talk about patents very confidently. 20 years down the line, it was the last needle on the haystack. Everyone was really shocked, and every government officer was talking about it. There was a question in the Lok Sabha. So that's when it was a talk among the scientific community, and it really affected them. When one scientist develops a particular variety, he takes 10 years. So 10 years of his research just completely nullified by one guy in Rice Tech who says that now I've got a rice variety. And he copies the same thing that you did. He picked up your own genetic resources and he made his rice variety. I mean, it was really shocking.
All varieties are bred and notified under the Seeds Act 1966 for cultivation in the officially demarcated geographical indication area, which covers India's 7 northern states.
News on claims of farmers in Pakistan growing Indian basmati in their farms. Now, both countries are eyeing the GI tags so that their basmati varieties get this stamp of authenticity. Rajeshwari is confident India will win this one.
I am quite sure that during the course of this battle, they will somehow win because Dehradun Basmati, and that's the original Basmati. Pakistan is opposing just for the sake of it because they feel that their Basmati, if they do not win in the world market, they will absolutely lose their position. So it's a life and death battle for them because rice is one of the major products that they export. And I think we have a very good case as far as India is concerned. And the APIDA, which is the body which is looking at all the rice exporters and taking up their concerns, is fighting battles for Basmati, for the Basmati rice GI tag, not only in India, but they are fighting all over the world.
Now, the other thing to call out here is the cost at which basmati comes to our plates. Not the price that you pay directly for it at the supermarket, but the price that our planet pays.
The expansion of the basmati economy results in an expansion of an altogether unsustainable fossil fuel economy. Closer to our time, in the last 10 or so years, you've also seen a phenomenon whereby those growers who grow organic basmati rice without the aid of fertilizers can sometimes fetch higher prices in the market, affluent consumers who like to buy organic strains of rice. As with other varieties of rice, there is a question of how we deal with crop residue and stubble, because so much of it gets burnt in regions like Punjab and Haryana closer to the winter when multi-cropping ensues. And this has deleterious and detrimental effects for the air quality of the region, as we all know.
This year has been another year of delayed monsoons and scorching summer. Singh and his colleagues are gearing up to make basmati resilient to the ravages of climate change.
So, in view of changing climates, global warming, and concerned about greenhouse gas emission, we have to adapt to technologies which are having less impact on environment when we produce the grain. So, focusing our research efforts on breeding for heat tolerance, drought tolerance, high temperature tolerance, disease resistance, and insect resistance. And of course, without any compromise on the key basmati related quality traits. So this is what we are going to do. And in that process, we have now come out with varieties which are suited for direct seeded rice.
He's talking about growing rice from seeds sown in the ground as opposed to transplanting seedlings from a nursery. Connecting rice cultivation to carbon credits is actually another area that Singh says is gaining momentum and ultimately expanding the area of production within the GI marked states. What does seem certain is Basmati's future lies in matching step with sustainability.
It's also something of a double-edged sword. The profusion of these genetically modified, lab-engineered strains of rice does arrive at the expense of greater genetic diversity, particularly of wild-type rice. And these wild types of rice they obviously don't yield as much as the basmati. It's impossible to think about the future of a sustainable agrarian complex without thinking about genetic diversity, particularly because of how fast plant diseases spread these days. And so I would hope that for millets in particular, but also for other types of wild rice, we continue to maintain seed banks and to ensure that there is still some wild type cultivation outside of profitable market focused cultivation.
So there you just heard Ashok Kumar Singh, Rajeshwari Hariharan, Venkat Srinivasan, and Harshvardhan Raghunandan giving us this big picture on basmati. Next time you're about to dig into your favorite rice, I do hope you remember these stories of scientific trials and triumphs. Stay tuned for our next episode in the Biolore series. We'll be digging into ancient DNA. This ride into interesting stories in the history of biological sciences in India has just begun.
On the sands of time, stories unfold, treasures from the past to modern lore. Every leaf, every cell, life secrets they tell. Biolore.
This episode was brought to you with support from the National Centre for Biological Sciences.